welcome back to the world of Spirit and Shield. As always, my name is John and I will continue to be your guide on this journey. So today we have a brand new short story called The Men Who Fight. I'm really excited about this one. I put a lot of work into it. I do apologize that it's coming a little bit later than the stories typically come, which is usually like once every 2 weeks. I think this one's definitely worth it though. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. It is a little bit longer. So if you need to take it in pieces, go ahead and do that. But hope you enjoy. And here we go. The Men Who Fight. I'll break your arm. What? Messner looked up from his boots with a rather confused look. Who are you? He said. Doesn't matter, the man replied. I'm going to break your arm. Messner continued staring at the man, who didn't seem to be big or tough enough to be making such threats to strangers, although Messner did not look that menacing himself. The man's face was calm and relaxed, even pleasant. Like many of the others, he was more or less clean-shaven, with sandy brown hair, neatly trimmed around the ears, and clear brown eyes. He seemed in most respects to be a completely normal, even sophisticated human being, with one glaring exception. He was a man-at-arms. Men-at-arms spent most of their time with other men-at-arms, and although they came from all around Hellenica, they had developed a culture all their own. Messner was technically a man-at-arms as well, but he was still new. He'd recently acquired his gear and completed his training. He was, however, still culturally Norian, though he hadn't been in Noria, or even seen the river Nor for which it was named, in nearly 2 moons. Form up! A sturdy man of about 50 walked over with the air of a wild boar. The first sergeant. Messner knew from training, and was quickly learned from experience, that the first sergeant was not someone to be ignored or questioned. Neither was the second sergeant, for that matter. There was no need for a third. Messner assumed that the military, having created the first 2, decided that was quite enough, and new recruits wouldn't be able to survive more than just 2. When the first sergeant said to run, you ran. If he said to crawl, you crawled. If he said he was half goat and king of the known world, you offered him the finest grasses and bowed and bawed as you offered them. Now the first sergeant was saying to form up, and in a matter of seconds, the gaggle of men lounging about in the field became 4 clear lines. New recruits like Messner in the front 2 ranks, the more experienced soldiers behind them, swords in the middle, spears on the flanks and rear. Each man wore more or less the same equipment. Dull metal breastplates with shoulder guards, thick padded linen jackets underneath, metal arm and leg guards, a dull blue piece of fabric wrapped over the shoulder, hung across the body and tied off at the hip, and a round metal helmet that flared out at the bottom in all directions. The men were all given the same gear and the same weapons, made in the dragon forges of Jura Apteri. All wore the same red and blue armband on their upper left arm, designating that they fought under the banner of the 14th Regiment of Arms, the Spiral Eagle. This was a professional army. These were professional warriors. But for the look of uncertainty in their eyes and the softness of their flesh, the front 2 ranks looked identical to the 2 behind them. Out of the corner of his eye, Messner spied the first sergeant approaching the front of the formation. The young soldier next to Messner turned his head to look. Instantly, one of the older soldiers behind him kicked him sharply in the back of the knees, while another grabbed him by the shoulders and threw him backwards. The young man landed hard in the dirt. Messner fought back the urge to help him. But you don't move when in standing formation. All the men-at-arms knew this simple rule. The young man who turned his head to look at the first sergeant simply forgot. It was not likely he would forget again. The first sergeant placed himself squarely at the front of the formation. The young man was pulled to his feet with such conviction that he actually left the ground briefly before returning to it again. If the first sergeant cared about or even noticed the affair, he didn't show it. After a moment of silence, his voice broke like a storm. We're going to the Broken Pass. The formation, which was already quiet as the grave, got quieter. Being careful not to move his head, Messner glanced at the man next to him. He looked terrified. Messner hoped he was doing a better job at hiding his emotions than his comrade. The Broken Pass. The name was as familiar as a recurring nightmare. Men from all over Hellenica had been fighting and dying there for over 10 years now. It wasn't that they were losing the war, but as Messner heard one of the others say, there were so damn many of them, and they don't know when they're beaten. They, of course, referred to the Mamaki. Though technically from the same ancestral line as humans and therefore Hellenicans, they were seen as subhumans, having separated from the main line ages ago. They were physically different. Their limbs were long and thin, their eyes set unnaturally deep in their heads. They lived differently. Their villages were simple mud and clay huts that climbed up the slopes of the hills and mountains of the Broken Pass. They wore simple clothing and rarely spoke, using their eyes instead to convey most messages. Their society was old, archaic, and it had remained unchanged, undeveloped for centuries. The chieftain saw no need for change, though there were many Mamaki who yearned for language, for literature, for great cities of their own that towered above the pass instead of hiding in its shade. They longed for civilization. Rival factions began to form, one supporting the old ways and the other supporting change and progression. The death of the chieftain and division among his own sons soon sent the conflict into a full-blown civil war. The previously unknown conflict soon dominated every conversation and social gathering in Hellenica. The men analyzed the diplomatic and military maneuvers in taverns, while the women decried the atrocity of the increasingly brutal conflict. Messner was just a child at the time, but he remembered the looks of concern on his parents' faces, and the serious tone everyone took when talking about the pass. The people of Hellenica began to intervene long before their government did. Wealthy merchants and entrepreneurs paid for caravans of food, medicine, and clothing to be sent to the progressive faction. The progressives fought hard and made some progress. Each colony, borough, and town they took raised hopes of a quick victory, and every Hellenican household waited to hear good news from the Broken Pass. Good news was not to come. Instead, the progressives' attack lost momentum and stalled. In the stalemate that followed, Hellenican caravans of supplies increased, even beginning to include weapons. Then, one summer evening, a caravan of supplies meant for the progressive faction was attacked in the pass. 7 Hellenicans were killed. From that moment on, the war would no longer be civil. Hellenica declared war on the traditionalists, and within that same moon, the Hellenican hammer began pounding away at the pass, beating the traditionalists back into the hills and securing the main Mamuk towns. That was 10 years ago. Much had happened since the hammer first fell on the Broken Pass. The traditionalists retreated into the hills and mountains, but they carried on the fight, raiding towns, ambushing caravans, and carrying out assassinations. What had initially been a war of conquest devolved into a war of attrition. The Mamuk traditionalists fortified their positions in the mountains, and the Hellenican military built bases and frontier forts in the valleys. The war continued without haste, and men-at-arms stopped returning to their homes in Hellenica. War in the Broken Pass had become a routine. Messner now found himself climbing into a covered wagon, with 20 other Hellenican men-at-arms, heading down the same road the wagon had traveled countless times over the last decade. From the back of the wagon, Messner watched the green meadows of Noria fade out of sight. A soft rain began tapping on the canvas roof, and soon, Messner and several other recruits, exhausted from excitement and anticipation, fell asleep. In his dreams, Messner returned to the only world he had ever known in all his 16 years. He was standing in a green field. The sun's rays settling on the morning mist clothed the field in a sheen of silk and gold. A flock of sheep grazed nearby and drank from the stream which flowed past a small stone cottage, and then to the river Nor. Messner's older brother stood leaning against the side of the cottage with his hands in his pockets. He took something from his pocket and put it into his mouth. Messner tried to call out to him, but was interrupted by the voice of his father summoning them both for breakfast. Messner ran inside. His brother remained where he was. Immediately upon entering the cottage, Messner was met by the aroma of fresh-baked honey bread and by a hug around his legs from his little sister, and he could not decide which was sweeter. Messner looked toward the stone oven that stood in the center of the room. His mother was reaching in to retrieve the honey bread. She turned, looked up, and smiled warmly, her blue eyes soft and content. He moved towards her and reached out to take the loaf of bread. A crack of thunder threw Messner back into the wagon, bouncing up and down and side to side. Most of the others were still asleep. He took out a small bundle of cloth and slowly unwrapped the sparse remnants of a loaf of cold honey bread. He carefully took a bite, trying not to drop it in the rolling wagon. He packed the rest away. He tried to go back to sleep, but found himself unable to. The soldier sitting next to him, a dark-haired beanpole from Alanekia named Deccan, was awake too. He got up, climbed out of the back of the wagon, and relieved himself on the side of the road. It was the 5th time he'd done it in the past hour. He looked pale as death and his hands were shaking. Messner shook his head. He was nervous too, of course, but he took a small sense of pride from the fact that there were other recruits worse off than himself, and it calmed him. The wagons moved slowly, so Deccan did not even have to run to catch up with it. He climbed inside and stared at the floor, seemingly focused on the muddy straw that covered it. "You feelin' well?" An accented voice called from the opposite side of the wagon. Messner contemplated the accent. He hadn't traveled much, and in fact had never been to any of the other city-states that together made up Hellenica, but enough travelers passed through Noria that he thought he recognized the man's accent. Deccan continued his watch on the floorboards. He blinked twice rapidly and said, "I'm fine," in a voice that made it perfectly clear that he was not. "Well, in that case, why don't you go out and help the wagon master keep a lookout? Don't worry, we're plenty safe here, but his eyes aren't what they used to be. Just need some help staying on the road and out of the ditches." Deccan nodded and began to climb out of the wagon. The other man stopped him, grabbing him by the arm. Reaching into his pouch, he pulled out a stick of tobacco, lit it, and gave it to Deccan. After Deccan had left, the man glanced at Messner and winked. "For the nerves," he said. He offered one to Messner as well, which he politely refused. As the man lit it and stuck it into his own mouth, he continued to eye Messner. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Noria," Messner replied. "Ah, that explains it," the man said, smiling slightly. "Didn't want to be a farmer, did you? Got tired of all that hauling hay and shaving sheep?" "No, I could have been a farmer, but I wanted to help," Messner said, his brows stiffening at the man's mocking attitude. The man nodded and smiled a sad smile. "Well, either way, good to have you with us. You seem a bit steadier than your island friend. What's your name?" "Messner Bronican." "Well met, Messner." The man reached out his hand. "Rudov." "Well met, Rudov," Messner said, shaking his hand. With hesitation, he added, "By the way, how long have you been there?" "The pass? 5 or 6 years, I think. Can't really remember." "Any advice?" Rudov exhaled deeply, as if bored. "It's not really so bad there. Eat, I suppose. Sleep, don't get killed, and have fun." He winked and drew on his tobacco, letting the smoke float up to the canvas and roll out of the back. The wagons rolled on with a martial pace, each one being pulled tirelessly by a single massive Bronidaire. Their muscles didn't even strain under their thick, hairless hide. They simply pointed their horns toward the horizon and walked, as if it were a migration. The slow pace of the wagons allowed the men to get out and stretch their legs. But still, even with all their anxiety about what lay ahead, they were eagerly looking forward to reaching their destination and being able to get out of the wagons for good. One night, after over 2 weeks of rolling and bumping along the estrade, the wagons finally stopped. The bleary-eyed men-at-arms gathered their packs and climbed out. For near on an hour they stood in the cold darkness, waiting for further instructions. Messner carefully looked around. Where were they? Was this the broken pass? Should he unsling his shield from his back? His hand touched the hilt of his sword. He glanced over at Rudolph. He looked relaxed, as always. His sword wasn't drawn, and in fact, although he was standing, he looked perilously close to falling back asleep. The first sergeant walked to the front of the formation holding a lantern. Welcome to Wetfoot. We'll rest here for a couple days. He pointed to a series of plain but well-constructed wooden huts. There are your quarters. Find room in one, no more than 8 to a hut. There's a fresh stream that flows behind it. If you need water, take a lantern and a comrade. And for everyone's sake, don't sink and piss in the stream. Get some rest. We've still a long road ahead. Dismissed. Messner entered a hut with only 3 other men in it. He didn't feel much like conversing, so he found a spot in the back corner. He unfastened his woolen navy blue blanket that the men at arms wore over their shoulder. He rolled it out on the straw mat on the floor, placed his pack under his head, and closed his eyes. In a matter of moments, he was back in Noria, the smell of bread in his nose and the warmth of his little sister's hug around him. Messner awoke the next morning to find other soldiers had joined the hut during the night. Most of them were still sleeping. One was sitting up, writing what Messner could only assume was a letter home. After having dressed himself, Messner went outside. It soon became clear why the camp was called Wetfoot. The stream the first sergeant had mentioned the night before was part of a full-scale river that was pretty swollen and likely flooded the area from time to time. The camp itself straddled the river with an ample stone bridge in the middle. No doubt the camp originally sprung up to protect the bridge. Now, as Messner found out from the other soldiers, it served as a logistical base, a place to rest and restock in relative peace before going into the pass itself. The 14th Regiment of Arms would spend 3 days here, resting, eating, sleeping, drinking, and playing, before they once again loaded the wagons and set off for their next and final destination, the small hamlet of Kohaliev, in the northwestern part of the Broken Pass. As the men loaded back into the wagons, the feeling of mirth and relaxation of the camp gave way to uncertainty and an impending sense of doom. The inevitability of the future haunted Messner and sat in the pit of his stomach. The wagon pulled away to an unknown land and an unknown fate. The next leg of the journey was much shorter, and in 2 days the wagons rolled inside the gates of Kohaliev. Messner stared in awe as they passed guards in full armor, with spears and swords at the ready. 2 towers, each with 3 heavily armored archers, rose up on either side. Each archer had an arrow nocked and ready. The wagons rolled on through. The gates shut heavily behind them. The men passed dozens of clay and mud houses with intricate, deep blue designs on the sides. The roofs were not slanted, as the farm cottages in Noria, but flat with a sort of clay wall about a meter high rising up from the roof on all 4 sides. Some roofs had clothes hung out to dry. Others had tables and chairs. They had water systems and small gardens. Suddenly, one recruit called out to no one in particular. A bit more civilized than I was expecting of the Maimaki. Rudolph and the other more experienced soldiers laughed. That's because they're Hellenikins, soldiers and their families. That many? The recruit replied in justifiable shock. The hamlet was more of a small city than a base. Rudolph just shook his head and smiled. The wagons continued bumping and rolling along through Kohaliev. There were some signs that it was indeed a military base. Training grounds, stables, blacksmith shop, armory, but it also seemed like almost any other town in Hellenica. There were taverns and pubs, merchants and traders, butchers and... Is that what I think it is? Decken said suddenly. His eyes were fixed on a large building with no walls. 7 great stone pillars held a large azure dome aloft, as if it were the sky. Is it really a... Decken started. A temple. Rudolph broke in. Isn't that a little archaic? Decken said. You'll find things are a bit different here in the pass. Most things are archaic or even older, Rudolph responded. He was no longer smiling, but seemed lost in thought. The wagon stopped, to the young recruit's great disappointment, not at one of the beautiful villas, or even clay and mud houses they passed, but at a series of huts very similar to the ones they had just left behind 2 days ago at Wetfoot. It didn't take long for the new recruits to settle in. They wasted no time in not only occupying their simple huts, but in roughly furnishing them with crates and wood planks that served as improvised tables, benches, and chairs. The recruits also began adding some luxuries, such as animal skins and draperies. Messner shared a hut with Decken and 6 others. One of the others, Merkin, who had come from Selandia, was quite an artist and decorated their hut with some rather inappropriate, although amusing artwork. The new recruits even dug small cellars in their huts to keep food and, more importantly, drink cool and fresh. This was all done by following the examples of the older men-at-arms. One experienced soldier was assigned to each hut to keep an eye on the new recruits and to help them adjust to life in the pass. Messner remembered the older soldier with the pleasant face who had earlier threatened to break his arm, and was relieved to find Rudolph assigned to his hut. The older men-at-arms who did not live with the new recruits had their own houses, or more commonly, villas, where several soldiers, typically from the same squad, and their families lived together. Messner looked in wonder at the permanence of these residencies, where new generations were being born and raised, and wondered, what if the war ends? The lives of the new recruits grew into a steady routine of exercise, training, meals, guard duty, and of course cleaning and maintenance of weapons, equipment, animals, and structures on the base. After about a month, that routine began to include regular patrols. Messner was naturally on edge the first time he went out the gates. His platoon, including Decken, Merkin, Rudolph, and a young round lad named Mackinaw, who was perpetually smiling though it seemed he lacked the wit to understand why, loaded into 4 battle wagons. Each wagon was armored. Metal plates hung down on the sides and over the slanted roof. The horses that pulled the wagons were armored as well, and painted. Similar designs to the ones on the houses were painted in an iridescent black on the horses' backs, shoulders, and legs. The horses themselves looked strange to Messner. Their manes were coarse and stood up on their necks instead of lying down. Their legs were more muscular than the farm horses Messner was accustomed to, and their eyes were fierce. A heavily armored archer stood on a platform inside the wagon, with his torso sticking up through the roof. This was what the men called the rat nest, though Messner had no idea why. 8 wagons, each with 10 men, went through the gate. Messner sat in the 3rd wagon. Not long after leaving Kohaliev, they heard a sound like thunder and felt the ground shake. "Cambrians!" a young recruit called out, peering through one of the windows in the wagon. Messner looked in that direction, and sure enough, about 20 men in segmented armor rode past, riding hard towards the head of the convoy. They had small shields slung on their backs. Each also had a quiver of javelins hanging down from the side of the horse. They disappeared as quickly as they appeared, leaving only a cloud of dust and the echo of hooves. The Cambrians often rode out with the men-at-arms, though they fought independently. Messner felt the hilt of his sword, making sure it was still in place. His eyes darted around, though he had no idea what he was looking for. He was ready to spring into action, though he had no clue what he would do. His pulse quickened, though nothing was happening. Messner kept a watchful eye on every hill, every depression, every dry riverbed, and every insignificant shrub, but he was still caught off guard when it happened. "Wirst! Left, left!" The driver commanded the horses, and the wagon jerked to the left, following the wagon in front of it in a wide circle. The convoy stopped abruptly, and a certain amount of yelling and profanity ensued. "Stay put," Rudolph said sternly, seeing the young recruits anxiously shifting their weight. From the window, Messner could see the lead wagon stuck in what looked like a large ditch. He could also see the rest of the convoy moving slowly, then stopping, forming a defensive circle around the lead wagon. "What is it?" Messner asked, trying his best not to sound nervous. "Lead wagon hit a tunnel," Rudolph responded quickly. Shield the windows. The men quickly shut the windows, plunging the wagon into darkness. The air inside grew heavy and hot. The men sweated in their armor. After what Messner guessed to be about 10 minutes, though in reality it was hardly only 2, he understood why the men were commanded to stay inside instead of going to help the other wagon. A hard metallic thud from a blow on the roof echoed inside the wagon. It was followed by another, and another, until the pounding on the roof became a drum roll. Every now and then there was a grunt from the archer in the rat nest. Messner worried for the man, but the occasional ping, followed by a continual cursing at the barrage of arrows, let Messner know that the man's heavy armor was doing its job. Rudov's face was set in stone. No one said a word until the volley stopped. After that, no words were needed. Even the new recruits had heard about the Memaki tactic of tunneling under the roads, then ambushing stopped caravans. The archers responsible for the barrage were likely out of sight. Already knowing where the convoy would be forced to stop, there was no need for them to see their target. With the volley apparently completed, everyone waited for the next part, the attack. Messner fixed his eyes on the floor. His ears waited for the command to get out and meet the attackers. More shouting outside. Was this it? The driver yelled. The wagon lurched forward. "Get those windows open," Rudov yelled. "It's too sakin' hot in here." The windows flung open. The light was blinding, but Messner had to see what was going on. The wagons were all moving now, straightening the defensive circle out into a line on the road. The wagon that had previously been the lead wagon joined in the middle. One of its horses lay dead, its leg hanging limp in the tunnel. Messner didn't see any Cambrians, nor their horses. The convoy continued without them. The men remained on edge from the incident with the tunnel until the convoy reached the Mamuk town of Dodok, without further incident. Once there, the men got out of the wagon. Some helped load supplies while others kept watch. The men attacked this simple task of loading boxes and bags into the wagons with much enthusiasm. The menial physical task helped them blow off some steam after the rough ride in, and it certainly helped that they knew they'd get to relax once safely back in Kohaliev. Just as they were finishing loading the supplies, they heard the sound of hooves. Messner looked toward the front gate, where the Cambrian cavalry was riding steadily toward them. Both horses and men were dirty and covered in blood. The Cambrians, though, were smiling and joking with each other. "Where were they?" American asked. Rudolph smiled. "Remember that volley of arrows when we stopped? Well, they won't be doing that again. At least not those particular ones." His eyes narrowed, and a wicked smile reached up trying to meet them. The new recruits were silent. The blood, the laughter, that grin. Messner stared in shock at the callous disregard for life, even the life of an enemy. He remembered his mother and his father. What would they think of all this? He didn't have too long to dwell on it, for the convoy of battle wagons was moving out. Messner remained silent on the uneventful trip back. That night he dreamt of home again. It was the same dream. He was in the field, his brother leaning against the cottage. His mother had her back to him, taking the bread from the oven. But before he could see her face, he woke up. Convoys soon became as routine as training and eating, and the recruits became accustomed to this new addition to their lives. Wagons were typically sent out to get supplies, bring new recruits from Wetfoot, or to patrol the area and keep the traditionalists from getting too close to the bases and the Mamuk towns. After returning from a convoy, the men, young and old, would go to the Haustus, the beer hall in Kohaliev. The Haustus was a place for stories, games, food, drink, song, and dance. The drinking, though prevalent, was not the reason the soldiers frequented the establishment. It merely provided a catalyst for the conversation and camaraderie that flowed freely among the soldiers. There were no seats alone in the Haustus. Messner had been to the beer halls in Hellenica, and this one may have resembled them in appearance, with its high ceiling and ornately carved woodwork, but the men who dwelt there gave it a spirit all its own. Messner grew to love this post-convoy ritual, so much that he found himself almost looking forward to the convoys, if only to return to the hostess afterwards to share food, drink, and stories. There was something else that made Messner fond of the beer hall in Kohaliev, or rather, someone else. She was a young, tawny-haired girl about Messner's age named Krisha. She was the daughter of another man-at-arms who had been in the Broken Pass since the war started. He had bought a house in Kohaliev and moved his family there about 6 years ago. Krisha's case wasn't really that unusual, and there were a fair amount of wives and children of men-at-arms living in Kohaliev alongside the soldiers. Messner flirted openly with Krisha, something he never would have done in Noria, and Krisha flirted back. And the whole thing became a sort of game the two played together and didn't take too seriously. Though he had grown accustomed to life in Kohaliev, Messner was still uncomfortable with the idea of battle, of dying, and even more, of killing. He did not know what he would do, or if he was even capable of killing. The decision to kill or not continued to haunt him. The decision, however, was not his to make. It began as most convoys did: a simple order, equipment check, loading, and setting out. Before the wagon left, Krisha ran out to meet them. This alone was somewhat unusual, and startled Messner as he thought something was wrong. Her brown eyes sparkled green in the sunlight, but they held a fire in them Messner had not seen before. "Kamosh met kunyam," she said. She stared at him intently as the wagons jerked forward and away. "Come back with honor." The ancient words Messner had heard the others' families say to them when they went out left an imprint in his chest. It was the first time anyone had said them to him. It was scorching, with a breeze that, although not exactly cool, still helped keep the dry heat at bay. Messner was in the lead wagon with Decken, Merkin, Mackinaw, and Rudolph. "The milkmaid buys drinks for everyone when we get back," Rudolph said with a mischievous grin, already foreseeing the trouble he'd get into at the beer hall. "No, no way," Decken spoke up. "One round, maybe two max. I had to barter half my clothes the last time to cover drinks." The wagon erupted in laughter. "It's not funny, guys. I only have 3 socks left." The guys laughed again. "Wait," Merkin joined in. "Brestall traded for an odd number of socks?" During the commotion that followed, Rudolph quickly put his hands on his chest, covering his nipples. Messner knew this game. It only took him one loss to know he did not want to lose again. He copied the gesture. In quick succession, the soldiers all followed, with Decken being the last. "No, Vrest, no, I wasn't ready." He threw his arms up in protest. That was Decken's second mistake. Rudolph reached over and punched him in the chest with the might of a mammoth. Decken was just glad that he was wearing armor, unlike the last time, from which his nipples were still sore. "Hey, Decken, get ready to lose the rest of your—" Messner did not hear the last word. The wagon lunged violently forward and down with a hideous crack. The impact threw Messner and the others to the floor. When the wagon stopped moving, Messner heard the dreadful cry, "Tunnel!" Rudolph's thick legs lay across Messner's chest, and in all his armor he could barely move. "Pull the archer in," someone yelled. The man from the rat nest practically fell inside with the impact of a meteor, and the door to the rat nest was shut. "Windows! Shut the windows!" Rudolph yelled, struggling to his knees. With Rudolph's legs no longer pinning him down, Messner pulled himself up. The wagon was tilted on its side, but Messner managed to climb up and shut the window closest to him. Another recruit was struggling with the window on the other side when the inevitable volley came. An arrow struck him in the upper arm, the force and pain causing him to fall to the floor. Mackinaw, for the first time without a smile on his round face, reached over and quickly pulled him to the side, as 2 more arrows found their way in through the open window and embedded themselves in the wood planks. Everyone sat or knelt, waiting for the staccato thunder of arrows to stop. Messner looked around. In the darkness it was difficult to see, but he heard groaning. Then a frenzied wailing, panting, and stomping began outside. The wagon jerked rapidly from side to side, but held fast. "Vrst," Rudolph said suddenly. "They hit the Saken horse." One of the men began to get up. "Wait," Rudolph called out. The men waited as the poor creature thrashed about outside, and the volley of arrows died down. After an excruciating minute, a merciful second volley came, and the horse went silent. Just after the second volley stopped pounding the wagon, Messner heard shouts outside. Get out! Get out! To the line! Get out! Rudolph leapt up and kicked the door of the wagon open. Let's go, he commanded. Messner, still dazed by the quick succession of events, felt as if he were in a dream. He didn't recall getting up, nor commanding his body to crawl out of the door, but somehow it did. He ran. He followed Rudolph as he sprinted to the nearest wagon, in the circle of wagons that now formed a defensive perimeter. Rudolph didn't look back. He kept running, and Messner was shocked at how fast he was. Messner struggled desperately to keep up. His heart pounded in his chest, and his lungs strained against his breastplate. Men from the other wagons were already standing, javelins ready, on the ledges on the inner sides of the wagons that served as fighting platforms. Others stood in close formation between the wagons, shields in front, swords drawn, spears in the back ranks. Here, the wagon master yelled, pointing to the left side of the wagon that was still pretty open. Messner looked quickly at Rudolph, who was motioning for more men from his wagon to join the ranks defending the gap. Messner, here! Rudolph grabbed him by the shoulder and threw him into a gap in the front rank. Messner was shocked to find his shield up and his sword already in his hand. He did not remember drawing it. For the first time, Messner looked out. Several tall, dusty figures appeared to be coming out of nowhere. Where there had been but an empty plain with some scrub grass and rocks, there now stood dozens of Mamaki men with spears, staves, and long knives. There was no war cry, no command. They simply appeared and rushed forward toward the wagons. Their faces were set, their weapons were ready, and pointed at Messner and the rest of his platoon. Wait, we're not ready. Silly as it was, the thought leapt into Messner's mind. He heard yells, grunts, and curses behind him, the crash of metal, bone, and flesh. On the sides, they were attacking from everywhere. Messner held his shield firm as the enemy advanced. He happened to glance to his right and found Decken next to him. Having the milkmaid on his vulnerable side was not very reassuring, but Messner could still hear Rudolph's steady voice behind him. Archers, knock! He called out. Messner had completely forgot about the armored archers up in the rat nests. Volley! The Mamaki were only about 15 meters out, and the arrows ripped through them with devastating effect. They kept advancing. Knock! Messner could see their eyes now. 2 small candles in a cave. Volley! More fell. Shields! The call rang out clear, despite the groans and cries of the enemy as their ranks were perforated with javelins. Swords, ho! Messner raised his arm, elbow back, leveling his blade with the ground. Spears, high! A shadow of spears fell over him. The Mamaki struck the line. The ferocity of the impact shocked Messner, throwing him back. In a flash, multiple hands were on his back, pushing him and his shield back into place. He pushed against the mass of flesh. Desperation, frustration, push, shove. The spears above jabbed and stabbed the Mamaki line, until the pressure relieved. A Mammoth to the front right of Messner raised his long knife to strike Decken. Seeing the exposed flesh under the raised arm, Messner didn't think. He stabbed. He thrust his blade into the man and pulled it out. He was shocked at how easily the blade sunk in. The Mammoth fell, but wasn't quite dead. Messner wanted to finish him off, so he wouldn't suffer, but the Mamaki pressed in on their attack, trampling their wounded comrade. A heavy blow struck Messner's shield. Pain shot through the arm. He held tight. A clash, a gush, a groan. The blow did not come again. Hold the line, Rudolph yelled. Crack! Another Mammoth struck Decken's shield. Messner thrust, thrust, thrust. The Mammoth dropped to the ground under the flurry of blows. Messner deflected a spear directed at his legs, and found another coming at his face. He flinched, but another spear appeared from over Messner's shoulder and struck the Mammoth hard in the chest. He crumpled and fell to the ground, his attack incomplete. I got you, Rudolph's voice. More pushed in, more fell, More grunts and groans, thrust and stab, brace, push, crush, jab, grab. A Maymuk grabbed the top of Messner's shield, pulling it down and trying to wrench it away. Losing his balance and falling forward, Messner rolled his other arm up and brought his sword down unevenly on the Maymuk's head. Sword and skull splintered from the heavy though awkward hit and set Messner's arm ringing. The ferocity of the blow shocked Messner and the others. "Oh, Vish!" Rudolph exclaimed, laughing. Still laughing, he drew his sword and passed it up to Messner as a replacement. "Don't sake and break it, hero," he yelled, drawing a long knife not unlike that of the Maymuki. Messner smirked and continued to hold the line, shoulder to shoulder with the other men at arms, until the Maymuki stopped attacking and began withdrawing. A few more were killed as they turned to flee. "Here's the fun part. Kill 'em, boys!" Rudolph cheered, his face sporting sweat and smile. The sound of pounding hooves returned. The Cambrian cavalry, bloodied from slaying the Maymuk archers, rode down the rest of the retreating enemy. Messner walked around the wagon to get a better view. He tripped over a corpse, fell down, and started laughing. On the ride back, the men were in good spirits. A few of the men at arms had been killed in the melee, others, including Merkin, wounded. But they had met the enemy, many of them for the first time, and had defeated him. Messner had time now to reflect on the battle. He had killed not just one man, but several. He didn't even think as he did it. He just reacted. He began to feel ashamed of himself, and especially of the pride he felt in killing those men. "Mess." He looked up to find Rudolph looking hard at him. "It's normal. We've all been there." He put a hand on his shoulder. "It was them or us. Today it was them. Tomorrow," he shrugged, "it might be us. You did well. You should be proud." Rudolph lit a stick of tobacco and handed it to him. Messner took it and drew on it. "Swordbreaker." "Swordbreaker? Is that what we're calling you now?" Decken teased. Rudolph leaned back and stretched as much as the wagon would allow. Don't be jealous," he said. "By the way, I think today calls for a real wet one at the hostess. What do you think, milkmaid?" Deccan's pleased to be called anything else went unheeded, drowned in the laughter of the men of the 14th Regiment of Arms. That night at the hostess, for the first time, Messner, Merkin, Mackinaw, and even Deccan, who despite his shaky start, did remarkably well in his first combat, told their own stories. They toasted the men they lost. They teased, they joked, they drank. They lived. With men who fight like this, there's no way we will ever lose, Messner thought, the alcohol settling on his mind like morning dew. That night, Messner did not dream at all. He slept in peace and awoke in the morning ready for the next patrol. Istoran Fen. So that is the end of The Men Who Fight. I hope you enjoyed the story. Next week, I will be posting another video addressing any questions or comments that you had about this story. So if you do have any questions or comments, go ahead and throw them down below, or you can send me a message on social media as well, and I'll be taking a look at those. And again, next week, we'll address those, as well as some inspirations and going into a little bit more depth with the world building on this story. I would like to take a moment just to thank all of my supporters on social media. Thank you guys for following me, for staying up to date with the goings-ons in this fantasy world, and especially to my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron, the link is down below. You do get access to the PDF versions of these stories, so you can download them, read them at your leisure, instead of having to have me read them to you. And you also get access to some additional content, including bestiary entries and some little articles and stuff that go into a little bit more depth on the world of Spirit and Shield. So go ahead and take a look at that. Even if you're not interested in becoming a patron, take a look at it. There is a lot of stuff on there for everyone. So I guess that's all I have for you today. Again, thank you so much for joining me for this story. I really enjoyed this one. I enjoyed writing it. Hope you enjoyed hearing it as well. And so next week we have the commentary on this one. In 2 weeks we will have another story. So as always, thank you for joining me and take care.